League for Peace and Freedom show, The Wake Up Call on WCOM LP, Chapel Hill and Carver, 103.5 on your FM dial, or live streaming at WCOMFM.org. You can also watch the show on the People's Channel after a week's delay on Thursday night at 10, Friday morning at 6, or Tuesday at noon. The show will also be available on our YouTube channel, Wilf Wake Up Call. I'm Iris Schwintzer here with our host, Lori Hoyt, and Leo Hare on the camera, and today our special guests are Lucy Lewis and Liz Wilderman.
Thanks, Iris. I'm really glad that Lucy and Liz could be here, and we have a very important topic today about the Greensboro Massacre. And both Liz and Lucy are on the National Steering Committee for the 40th anniversary of the massacre, and both of them are survivors of that massacre that happened 40 years ago. Is going to be some of our listeners who will know what the Greensboro Massacre is about, but a lot of them will not. And so I think a good place for us to start off is about the Greensboro Massacre and what is that about and what happened, and you can share, each of you, as you take turns telling us about it.
Sure. Thanks, Lori. 40, we're sharing a mic today.
Yes, we're sharing a mic. It's all volunteer, and one of our mics is down, so.
It was 40 years ago next month that in Greensboro, North Carolina, a 9-car caravan of Ku Klux Klan and Nazis drove into a predominantly African-American public housing neighborhood, Morningside Homes in Greensboro, and opened fire on demonstrators. The group there was getting ready for a rally and an educational conference. It was organized by the Communist Workers' Party, and Liz and I were both members of the CWP, and it was organized by the CWP as well as other local community activists. And the idea was to have an educational conference to talk about how racism is dividing black and white workers, how that's historically been an issue. But the caravan of armed white supremacists and white nationalists drove up to where people were gathering and opened fire. They killed 5 of our friends, Jim Waller, Mike Nathan, Sandy Smith, Cesar Calce, and Bill Sampson. They wounded 10 others, and it terrorized the community. Here we are 40 years later, and a lot of people, like you mentioned, Lori, really don't know a lot about what happened. There's been a false narrative. The events have been characterized as 2 extremist groups or a shootout, and that false narrative really does a disservice to history. One is that if we don't really understand history and its lessons, then we will repeat the same mistakes. And the other is that it prevents the social justice movements and today's activists and organizers from really understanding the lessons from what happened. So part of the reason that we are organizing for a 40th commemoration is to both honor those who were killed that day as well as to share the lessons of what happened. Liz?
Yes. I would like to speak about the role of the Klan in this. The Klan and the Nazis around that time were organizing nationwide, and they organized a group called the United Racist Front and were recruiting and going around trying to recruit people. And so when they started doing that, we as members of the Communist Party and activists really wanted to respond to that. And have a good analysis about exactly who the Klan is. The Klan and the Nazis, in our view, in my view, are used as tools of the state to divide us all. And so having that viewpoint, really, we wanted to go to Greensboro that day to educate people about that and not to mistake the enemy as the Klan and the Nazis, but that the real problem are the powers that be in this country who want us divided. So that's a little bit about why we wanted to go. And we were going to have, as Lucy said, an educational forum when everything changed that day.
Everything changed for, I think, all of your lives. But in leading up to that then with this education, I think it'd be good for our listeners to know all the work that you and your compadres or compatriots were doing in terms of education. I'm thinking of one of the ones who I think was killed, and I'm not sure which name, maybe Nathan, was working, it was a doctor, but was working in a textile mill to help organize. And I'm a little more hasty on those details, but I think it's so important to know that a group of you were sacrificing a lot of your lives for this cause of social justice and for justice for workers. And I think that will help us understand why this was such a tragedy, that you all were young people and there was a whole group of you working together in many ways. And I just think it'd be good to spend a little bit of time telling us a little bit more about that background, either one of you or both of you.
Yeah, the conference was in the context of the fact that we had been doing work in the state, some people like Nelson and Joyce Johnson, for 15 years in Greensboro, working with the Greensboro Association for Poor People. They helped to organize, students organized for Black Unity, youth organized for Black Unity. Others had been involved a little bit more recently, but had been putting in years of work on a number of different fronts. And in particular, we had been working in working class jobs and to organize among workers, realizing that that's the real strength of a mass movement. So folks who were killed were really leaders in those efforts. Jim Waller was a doctor. He did some of his medical training at Duke Hospital, and he left that to go work at Haw River, which is a small textile factory on US 70. And there he really helped to revitalize the union. That North Carolina, as our listeners know, is a right-to-work state. So our unions, the number of people who are in unions is really low, and one of the reasons that that was a problem in the 70s was a lot of the unions really were not actively taking up workers' efforts and struggles. So Jim jumped right into that, helped lead people fighting their grievances. He also led a strike there at a time when Cone Mills was making a big profit, and people were expecting to see some raises, and instead they started laying people off. He had been elected president of his union there at Haw River. He'd been fired for his job when the company realized that he was becoming a rank and file leader, and then the workers voted him back in again. Bill Sampson was also working in the textile mills in Greensboro. He was working at White Oak, and he was running for president when he was killed in Greensboro. Sandy Smith had been student body president at Bennett College, where she was enrolled before she graduated and went to work in Greensboro at Revolution Mill. It's called Revolution because it was doing revolutionary techniques for creating textiles. And then she had been really successful there, particularly working around issues of sexual harassment for women workers. And she had recently moved to Kannapolis to work in the mills there and help organize. Mike Nathan was a medical doctor. He was the lead pediatrician at Lincoln Hospital in Durham,
Uh-huh.
and he had also been very involved in helping organize medical support for African liberation struggles. And he had raised hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical supplies for ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union, and they had recognized how important that was. And the fifth person who was killed was Cesar Calce, and I'm going to let Liz say a little bit about that because she had worked with him at Duke.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I was going to ask you, and that'd be so important to know something about him.
So Cesar Calce was a Cuban immigrant. His parents came to the United States after the Revolution, and Cesar went to Duke, was quite an intellectual, and went to Duke and became politicized while he was a student at Duke. And did he graduate? I'm sure, sorry. I think, yeah, he graduated from Duke, and at that time became a ward secretary at Duke Medical Center. Instead of using his degree, he went to work with the workers at Duke and organized a union drive at Duke, which unfortunately was not successful, but the successful part is that he organized workers and was a leader at Duke and in the community.
And you worked at Duke with him, that's where you were working?
I was working at Duke, yes, I was a phlebotomist at Duke.
Mm-hmm.
I actually met Cesar because somebody that I worked with was interested in the union drive, and I said, well, I'm interested in that. That was my level of political involvement at that time.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I became politicized pretty quickly in
Uh-huh.
1979.
Okay, so you were just beginning your political education
Absolutely.
at that point, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this, I think, it helps us see what dedicated people all of you and your friends who were killed and wounded were in terms of trying to make it a better world. And it's really interesting how all of those issues are still with us today. It's not surprising, but in terms of race and white supremacy, and in terms of workers trying to get some rights in a right to work state, and increasingly since 1979, the gap between wealth gap is increased more and more. There's more and more the very rich, and more of us are sliding down into the poverty realm. So this was like a dramatic time, but it's still the forerunner of what we're dealing with today.
Yeah, part of the context for what was happening in 1979 when these attacks took place was actually that there were people around the country who were doing the same kind of work that we were doing. That there were organizers that were part of the New Left or the New Communist Movement who were doing really important good work. Just like the CWP in North Carolina was part of folks around the country that were part of our organization, working on the docks in Baltimore, working in shipyards in San Diego, working in auto plants around the country. But we were part of a larger movement of people who had gotten politicized through the civil rights movement and the black freedom struggle, folks that had been involved in the anti-war movement and the women's movement, and then began to look about the fact that the root causes for all these issues really was our economic and political system. And that if we wanted to see the kind of world where everybody is treated with dignity, when people have their basic human needs met and their human rights respected, that we'd have to be working for fundamental social change. So it was in this larger context that these murders took place. And we had been working, I mentioned earlier the work that Nelson and Joyce Johnson had been doing in Greensboro. But Workers' Viewpoint, which later became the Communist Workers' Party, had been involved in working to free the Wilmington 10. We'd been involved in a number of police brutality struggles. One in particular that comes to mind is down at Whitaker's, the eastern part of the state near Rocky Mount, where a white shopkeeper, Joe Judge, had killed a black agricultural worker, Charlie Lee. when he had shortchanged Charlie Lee, and it took, we'd been asked then to come in and help develop a campaign for justice. And eventually, Joe Judge had to make a monetary settlement to Charlie Lee's widow, Leola, which was one of the first times that a white man charged with the murder of a black man was found responsible. We were involved in finding the competency test, which was sort of the precursor to all the standardized testing we're seeing today. And we would go to schools, high schools, when they were getting ready to let out, and have a few people on the picket line with signs, and when the schools got out, we would have hundreds of young people come out. I mean, it was really extraordinary. So we had been doing that work, and then also, as I mentioned, the work particularly in textile mills, but also at Duke Hospital and other workplaces, and had been involved in a number of community struggles. So here was the opportunity to have, you know, a community and labor conference to talk about the historic role of racism. And that was a real threat to the status quo, which is why it wasn't just the Klan and Nazis coming together in the United Racist Front that Liz mentioned, but also we know that there was intervention, or lack of intervention, I should say, by the Greensboro Police, by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the FBI. We know, for example, that when we got the permit to have the rally and conference, which was delayed for a long time by the Greensboro Police. Usually you get a permit within 72 hours, and here we were 2 weeks out and a few days before the conference was to take place. And we still hadn't gotten a permit. So Nelson Johnson and Paul Bermanzon held a press conference to say we really need to get this permit. And we didn't know that when we got the permit, it would also be given to Eddie Dawson, who was an informant for the police and had also worked with other state agencies. So that was handed to the Klan and Nazis. We know that Rooster Cooper, who was a Greensboro policeman, was near where the Klan and Nazis gathered on the morning of November 3rd. He saw them putting guns into their trunks of their cars. He took pictures. The police knew this was happening and they did not let us know. We also know that traditionally police had showed up when we were doing competency tent struggles or community organizing, and would be harassing people and arguing over, you know, whether you're on the sidewalk or not, that kind of thing. And what we found out during the course of the trials that came after these murders was that the police were sent to an early lunch the morning of November 3rd, so that none of them were there. We also know that it was an agent of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, Bernard Butkovich, who actually brought together the white supremacists and the white nationalists. And it's our understanding that that was the first time this had happened, because historically the Klan had not worked with the Nazis. The Nazis were seen as the enemy during World War II. The Klan likes to think of themselves or promote themselves as patriotic, and so they had never worked together. But here was this agent of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms bringing them together in full Nazi regalia, showing up on October 23rd to bring the two groups together. So this was...
Let me ask you something else.
Sure.
So he was supposed to be working for the government, and what rationale did they give that he was bringing them together? Was that supposed to make things better? I mean, what was the rationale to do that?
We were not allowed in the trials that happened to be able to name the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms or the FBI. And it was not in the interest of the government to talk about the role they had played. There were...
So they didn't offer a rationale, you just were able to investigate and realize that that's what had happened.
That's right.
Oh my gosh.
It's also important to note about Butkovich, the ATF agent, was brought weapons to, he he was one of the ones that supplied the weapons for November 3rd.
Oh, you're kidding. So the government supplied the weapons and brought them together, but it wasn't allowed to be brought up at the trial.
Well, they didn't bring all the weapons,
Right.
but they brought some of them. They also showed people how to turn their shotguns into automatic weapons.
Oh my gosh. And so, but you couldn't bring that up at the trial.
There were 3 trials. The first trial was a state criminal trial. And there were so many problems with that, including the fact that the prosecution did not want to get the truth out about the role of the Greensboro police. So it was not in their interest to really bring out all the facts of what had happened.
So a cover up.
And we also had the foreman of the jury was openly anti-communist. And it was a situation where it was very hard for the facts to come out. And an all-white jury was chosen, and they found the Klan and Nazis not guilty. Then it took a big push to get a federal criminal trial. We had to really work with elected officials at the local, state, and national level to get them to have a second trial. And in that, once again, there was an all-white jury, and the Klan and Nazis were acquitted. The third trial took place 5 years later, and this time the plaintiffs, which included the widows of the people who had been murdered, as well as some of those folks who were wounded, brought civil charges, which means nobody could face jail time, but they could be found guilty and responsible for their actions. And this time we were able to charge more parties to what had happened. And as a result of that, for the first time, Klan, Nazi, and police were found jointly liable for the death,
So the police, wow.
for the Greensboro police, for their role in the death of Michael Nathan. And subsequently, since again it was a civil case, there was a $350,000 fine that was levied on the Klan, the Nazis, and the city of Greensboro, and the city of Greensboro paid the fine for everybody.
Oh, my dear.
So if you think that they were trying to keep the Klan and Nazis quiet, we think that would be a very accurate
Yeah.
conclusion to draw.
Yes.
Are you starting to say something?
So in those 5 years, and I don't know how much you want to go into that, I know there was a lot of hardship with the whole group of you, which was a whole support group working on all these things. I know that some people lost their jobs, and I don't know I know it was a real painful period where some people didn't want to get involved and you weren't getting some of the allies that you would have expected normally. I don't know if you want to go into that at all. It's up to you. I just want to throw that out there since I know a little bit about it.
It was a scary time.
Yeah.
It was very
Thank you.
scary, and we were being attacked on a lot of fronts. Not only with the false narrative that it was a shootout between 2 fringe groups, but we had people around us red baiting, telling us all kinds of stories that we could have caused this, or
Blaming the victims.
blaming the victims.
Mhm.
There were all kinds of narratives out there. But we also were fighting the FBI following us, the FBI trying to interview us all the time in our workplaces. It was a very scary time. And the main thing about that time was that we didn't back down. We felt very, very strongly, we were scared, but we felt very, very strongly that we couldn't go underground. We couldn't say that no, we're not gonna fight anymore. We were very determined at that time, and I think that we survived because of that.
One of the things that we sized up very quickly was it's going to be important to politically fight back against what had happened, like Liz was saying. And so for the next 5 years, despite the deaths and the fact that everybody who'd worked in the textile mills was fired, and other folks were fired as well, and the lack of understanding of what had really happened among the progressive community. I lost my train of thought, but it'll be back in a second. Politically fight back. So we did a number of things. One was that we really organized on the legal and political front to, as much as possible, uncover the truth of what had happened and to hold the perpetrators accountable for what had happened. We built the United Front with allies not only in North Carolina but around the country and to a certain extent around the world, who realized that this was an attack not only on the CWP, but it was really a warning to revolutionary groups and organizations. This could happen to you. It was really a setback for the entire movement. It had a chilling effect on work that people were doing in their organizing. We did a lot of outreach and speaking to people, and then of course we engaged in the trials as well. And we did it not just because, that we were survivors and we weren't going to stop the work that we were doing, but because it's important for the movement as a whole. And that's one of the lessons I think to share today, is that when people are attacked, that they need to politically fight back.
Yeah. It's time for a station break, and we'll be back because there's a whole lot more to talk about. And okay, Iris. Oh, that's right. We're sharing mics.
This is Wilf's Wake Up Call on WCOMLP Chapel Hill and Carrboro, 103.5 FM. You can stream us live at WCOMFM.org.
Okay. Do we have any announcements? Lucy, there's an announcement. Well, we're going to go into a big announcement. Before that, I'll just say that that there's been some very big climate strikes on 2 Fridays in a row all over the world, and I just want to get that in there. So we're so quick to forget things, so I just want to have that marked there, and there'll be more. That has become a major issue. It affects everything. If the air we breathe, the water for all of us, and of course, like everything else, it will most seriously and quickly affect vulnerable communities, people of color, poor communities all over the world are in the most danger. So it's something that anybody who's for social justice, but also it is for all of us and for our children. And then the NAACP will be having their meeting this Saturday, their usual first Saturday of the month. But one of the things reason we're here today, there's a lot coming up for this 40th anniversary commemoration of the Greensboro Massacre. And so, starting that off, there is going to be a special fundraising event to support that commemoration. These commemorations cost a little bit of money, and that Greensboro Massacre was 1979. 40 years ago, it was 1979. Think about where you were then. It's going to support events taking place in November, reflecting the importance of understanding the relevance of the tragedy to challenges our country faces today. And I think that's so clear as we talk about those issues of white supremacy, of racism, of violence. And this is being sponsored by the beloved Community Center in Greensboro, which is being run by Joyce and Nelson Johnson, who were at the Greensboro Massacre. They're still in Greensboro, still working for a better world. And the The anniversary will involve a series of educational, religious, and cultural events to be held November 1st through 3rd and hosted by local colleges and churches. So it's going to be, the fundraiser for this is going to be on Saturday, October 12th, which is coming up so soon, 4 to 6 p.m. Oh, I like those hours. Nighttime, I get so tired. 4 to 6 p.m. on a Saturday, perfect, at Trinity Avenue Presbyterian Church on 927 West Trinity Avenue in Durham. And the Reverend, was now a Reverend, Nelson Johnson and Joyce Johnson will be the guest speakers. Oh, that's wonderful. A short program will also include a video presentation and a reception to follow. And so this is the impetus for this particular day of having our guests Lucy Lewis and Liz Wilderman come and tell us this very complicated and it's like something in a book, complicated and interesting and tragic event, and that's not way back. It's right in modern times. It's not that long ago, folks. Many of us were here and remember it. So, and we'll mention that again at the end. And you can, I'll let you read the RSVP. So if you want to do that, it'd be RSVP to L. Lewis 2001 at earthlink.net, or call 919-929-5983. Anybody who listens to this program knows you should always have your pencil or pen and paper available, because we always try to give you some ways to get more information. And so if you missed what we just said now, we're going to mention it again another time or two, so that do have your paper and pencil ready. And it says if you are unable to attend but able to support us in this important work, please visit Greensboro Massacre Lessons for Today. That's pretty easy to remember. Greensboro Massacre Lessons for Today. And if you go to that, you can donate. So
.org.
Oh, .org is not on here. Okay, that's an important thing then. Thank you, Liz. .org. Greensboro Massacre Lessons for Today .org. Okay, so back to Lucy Lewis and Liz Wilderman, who were survivors. I think I gave you one of my papers too behind that. Were survivors from that terrible day on November 3rd in 1979. Lucy, I think you were a couple blocks away, and Liz, you were right there.
No, I was a couple of blocks away as well.
Oh, you both were a couple blocks away, heard the gunfire and rushed to find out what had happened. Yeah, because at a protest, people were, it was in a housing project, so people were lined up along the streets there, not expecting anything like this, because as you said earlier, the police or the Bureau of Firearms or the FBI, nobody warned you that these people were carrying guns, and therefore this tragedy unfolded without any protection or ability to protect yourselves. So there's going to be this fundraiser that I hope a lot of us will go to on October 12th. So should we talk about, do we want to go back to some more of these memories? But I think another important thing I don't want us to lose and forget to do, there was a Truth and Reconciliation project. And that was what, about 4 or 5 years ago? 3 or 4 years ago. So please tell us about that, because that was unusual. I think it's the first in this country.
Well, actually, I was going to talk briefly as part of the aftermath of what happened.
Yeah, let's go back to that.
Was that there were 3 particular significant things that happened that support the truth, as we're talking about it today, about what happened on November 3rd. And first was the victory in the civil rights trial that correctly placed the murders at the hands of the Klan, the Nazis, and the Greensboro police, although we know that there were other actors involved who were never able to be charged. The second was the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was really significant. That was the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's been held in this country. But in order to have that process happen, we actually drew a lot of strength and information and support from other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that have been held around the world. In particular, I think about Bongani Finka, who had been one of the commissioners in South Africa for their TRC process, and he came to Greensboro to help in that effort, and he said, because you made our struggle your struggle. In other words, talking about the fact that we had been involved in anti-apartheid work and supporting the African liberation struggles. So that was incredibly meaningful. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was organized not only to get to the truth of what happened in Greensboro, but people who were involved in that process were very clear that we wanted to develop a model that could be used in other communities in the United States. So we needed to do that in a way that would really have many lessons that could be used, and in fact that's been true since then, that the Greensboro TRC process has been held up by groups that are working in Maine, Mississippi, Boston, South Dakota on their own truth processes. And then,
I didn't know that. That's wonderful.
yeah. Recently on the website that we're doing for this and the Facebook page, there was a note from one of the Maine people thanking the generosity of folks in Greensboro for allowing their process to develop and go forward. And there was a documentary made about that just got an Emmy. So the ripples continue to go out, not only in Greensboro, but elsewhere. And the third is that there finally has been a marker placed at Morningside where the murders took place by the state of North Carolina, recognizing it as the Greensboro Massacre. So
That was a big day when that happened.
that was a big day, and some of you all were here, which was really important.
Just wanted to mention that was the first time that we saw that the marker actually called it a massacre. So,
Oh, yes, and that is so important after it was called other things earlier.
Right. So here, for the last 40 years, every 5 years in particular, we've been gathering for different ways to remember the people who were murdered. But this year, at a time when we're seeing tremendous economic crisis, not only in this country but globally, and we're seeing the rise of the same kinds of white supremacy and racism, and a president who's talking about both sides being equal, when you're talking about the murders that took place in Charlottesville, we felt that the focus really needed to be on lessons that could be shared with other folks who are involved in social justice work. So the focus for the events in Greensboro will really be sharing those lessons. This is actually part of a series of events that's being held around the country. There's already been a forum held in New York City. There will be ones in Massachusetts this weekend.
These forums are titled,
Different things. Greensboro Massacre Lessons for Today.
oh, they
Greensboro at 40.
Oh, they are talking about Greensboro.
Right.
Wow.
We had a remembrance ceremony about the 5 who were murdered last weekend at Highlander Center in Tennessee, which is a nationally known movement building center that themselves have faced attacks, most recently the burning of their office by right-wing forces. There will be events on the West Coast, and then there'll be the fundraiser. These are all opportunities to share the lessons, but it will culminate in Greensboro November 1st through 3rd. That first evening, November 1st, there's going to be a community reading of the play Greensboro Requiem by Emily Mann, a Princeton playwright. November 2nd is really going to focus on the lessons. There will be a plenary which will talk about the relationship of what happened in 1979 to the situation we find ourselves in today, and then a series of workshops that afternoon on a number of different issues.
So that'll be all day.
That'll be all day, but then we're going to celebrate that evening, that there will be a performance by the internationally known Contra Tiempo dance group. They do political dance, and the dance troupe was founded by Ana Alvarez, whose parents were part of organizing in North Carolina and part of the Communist Workers' Party. And then November 3rd will be a day of reverence. There will be a church service that afternoon at Shiloh Baptist Church, and Reverend Nelson Johnson and Reverend Herbert Nelson from the Presbyterian Church nationally will be speaking. So we really invite our listeners, if they're able to join us for any of those events. And if they're not able to, we're trying to capture as much of this as possible on the website after November 3rd. That will include videos of the events and sharing the lessons. And I want to make sure we talk about the lessons some, but I want to give Liz a chance to see if she wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah. So this is a really big deal, and it's a lot going on.
Yeah, it's a very big deal, and I think that the reason that I feel it's such a big deal is that we really have this wonderful opportunity to talk about what really happened, tell the truth about what actually happened that day. And it's interesting because I was visiting with a friend of mine a couple of years ago, and her son knew about November 3rd. He was in middle school, and he knew about what happened and did a project for his school in Durham on the Greensboro Massacre. None of the children had ever heard of it. None of the teachers had ever heard of it. So this is from people who live in North Carolina. Imagine the rest of the country. Another thing to note is that in terms of the media at the time of the murders, the day after the murders was when the Iran hostages were taken. So we went from page 1 minute, to page 13. So it's very important to get the word out about what actually happened.
Yeah.
It's not in the history books. It doesn't have the place that it belongs, that it deserves, and it definitely has a huge impact on history.
It doesn't, and with history, so often what the elites or the ones in power don't want remembered doesn't get remembered. And a similar thing that reminds me of the Wilmington, that for years you heard about the Wilmington race riot, until I think Timothy Tyson or some others wrote more about it and unearthed what really happened, that it was a massacre too, and a coup of the elected officials of this state, and the whole build up to that and what happened. And out of that, the News and Observer, which their forefather was one of the implicated people in it, came out with a whole little paper of apology and telling the true story. So that was so many years later. I hope it won't take that many years for the Greensboro Massacre. It sounds like part of that is that you all, as survivors, have united together and have kept the story going and have kept your work going in social justice, all of you. And I think that's part of where this story is. They've not, even though they put it on page 13 the next day because of the hostages, you have not let that happen and have kept this story alive and going.
Well, one of the lessons that we all take away is the importance of building community. That given an attack of this magnitude and the incredible pain and suffering that people had to endure, it could easily have torn us apart. And instead,
with blame and anger and,
yeah, it could really have gone that way, but instead people have continued to be activists in their different communities and their workplaces, locally and nationally as well. And that's one of the lessons that we think is really important to share with people, that times are going to get harder with the kinds of economic and political crises that are polarizing our country today, pitting people against each other, and the importance of building community and solidarity is really important.
and with the climate thing, rather than, trying to be okay just yourself and with the whole idea, like with Cuba, where when the oil was taken away, where they pulled together. I mean, there are models, and you all are another model of people uniting together and helping each other out in hard times and supporting each other.
I was actually looking at some footage of one of the events that was held in New York City last week, and there was a question from the audience about climate and the centrality of climate. And Nelson's response to that really was saying, people feel pain in many different ways. Mm-hmm. If people are facing racism and it's in their front, in their face, then they have to deal with it. If people are facing poverty and it's in their face, then they have to deal with that. If people are facing the impacts of a military budget, which has bases around the world, so there's not enough money for basic human needs, they have to deal with it. But it's how we deal with these issues is really important, and that's part of what we were doing back in '79.
Yeah.
Was not pitting one issue against each another, but recognizing that people will organize and resist on different issues, but we need to be able to talk about the relationship between them. And that's part of what was talked about in Greensboro on Monday, actually, when the Poor People's Campaign came to Greensboro for the MORE tour, the mobilizing, organizing, resisting, and educating tour that's going on. And both Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris, who are the co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign, as well as Nelson and Joyce, talked about how that campaign is talking about 5 different issues, about ending systemic racism, systemic poverty, militarism, climate devastation, and a moral narrative. And it's really in that tradition that we were doing the work then, and we think that's one of the lessons now, is to look at the root causes of all these different issues, and that we have to be working for fundamental transformation of our economic and political system if we're going to see the kind of justice that people were fighting for in 1979 when they were killed.
Yeah. So that this is like a wake-up call again for all of us about the importance of community and of getting together with like-minded folks to be in community, and too many people feel isolated and frustrated with all of these issues, or you're right, some people are hit more by one or more of these issues. And I think it's just so important for people to be encouraged and to think in terms of, these are hard times and I need to be with supportive people and work with them to make it better, and not just, gnash my teeth and storm around my living room.
Well, I think that's actually one of the positive things that we're seeing today, which is even as things worsen, that we're seeing growing resistance.
Yes.
We saw that with the Occupy movement back in 2010.
Yes.
We see it with the Dreamers. We see it with the movement for Black Lives. So really our audience with these hub events, with that kind of outreach we're doing, is to reach out particularly to young people today, as well as longtime movement activists and organizers, to be able to share lessons, to be able to talk about the role of the state in attacking movements and people who are seen as challenging the status quo, to be able to talk about the importance of a diverse, multi-issue movement, to be able to talk about working across different lines of identity, and the importance of resisting. So that's the positive thing I think that we're seeing today, is a whole new generation of young people who are rising up and who are understanding, I think to a deeper level than some of us when we were much younger, the fundamental root causes of what's going on. And here in Chapel Hill, in Carborough, in Pittsboro, in Hillsborough recently, we've seen the resurgence of white supremacists in the Klan. We certainly want to talk about how we stood up and will continue to stand up against that, but to understand the fact that they really are the pawns of a much greater system that's using them to try to divide and polarize people. And that's the real enemy that we're facing in our world today.
Well said, Lucy, well said. That is so true, because it's so easy to get, where so many people just get focused on Trump and not see him as the culmination of a lot that's going on in this country with both Democrats and Republicans, and that we don't get caught up in boogeymen or bad guys and then neglect the deeper issues, the underlying, especially the economic issues that are driving so much of what's happening with either race or climate or anything. And so we have just a few more minutes, so I just want to have you catch a breath or something and think about is there anything that you have not said, or maybe we can repeat about the 12th?
We can repeat about the 12th, but I want to talk a little bit about the five. The five were, of course, amazing political organizers.
The 5 who were killed.
The 5 that were killed. But they were also very human and down to earth and believed in community. They were gentle, kind people. And I think that's important to remember them. But also, they were doing such amazing, wonderful work that it was not a random thing that happened in Greensboro.
No.
They were targeted because of the work. So it wasn't as if the Klan came in and just shot people. They had specific people they wanted in order to try to destroy the Union building that they were doing in Greensboro and in Durham.
The effective leaders that they
Exactly.
targeted,
Exactly.
yes.
So, as Lucy said, to keep our eye on the truth, which is we're all in this, black, white, Hispanic, everyone, all of us are in this, it's the same struggle. And, yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that WILF is, it's sort of like the Poor People's Campaign. It's always been multi-issue and tries to make those connections between all those issues because they all are so interrelated. And so this is an opportunity to learn more and to be around people who are working on all these issues. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for people getting together. And so on October 12th, and I think you have the address.
Yeah, October 12th, 4 to 6 p.m. at Trinity Avenue Presbyterian Church, 927 West Trinity Avenue in Durham. There'll be a fundraiser to support the kind of events we're talking about in Greensboro, November 1st through 3rd. And it's a chance to hear from Reverend Nelson and Joyce Johnson themselves in more depth about some of the lessons we've talked about today. And if people are not able to come... And to remind our people they were there, like both of you were, they were there. I think Nelson was injured, wasn't he? Yes, he was stabbed in the arm by one of the demonstrators. And then he was charged with inciting a riot instead of the Klan and Nazis. In fact, at one point he was in jail for a $100,000 bond, twice what the Klan and Nazis were ever charged with. But this will be a chance to talk about it more in the community.
Yes.
So people can go on the Facebook page to Greensboro Massacre Lessons for Today to get more information about the fundraiser. And we certainly hope that people will join us in Greensboro November 1st through 3rd for Greensboro Massacre Lessons for Today, for any of the cultural events that are happening, and certainly for the conference and workshops that will be held there.
So Friday night would be a play about Greensboro?
Will be a community reading of a play.
A community
That's right.
reading of a play. Then all day Saturday will be workshops and a lot of learning, and then Sunday would be a time of reverence and
remembering, like Liz
And
said, the
remembering.
people who were
yeah,
killed.
Yeah.
We really want people to know them and love them as we did.
Well, we've been talking to Lucy Lewis and Liz Wilderman, dear friends, but also very importantly for what we're talking about, survivors of the Greensboro Massacre of 1979, and both of them are also on the National Steering Committee for the 40th commemoration of that massacre. And we've learned a lot, and I appreciate you both coming, and there's going to be wonderful opportunities for learning more. I'm Lori Hoyt, Iris Switzer is on the board, and Emily O'Hare is videoing this. You'll be able to get us on the People's Channel next week and also on YouTube.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you for coming.